Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by the National Science Teachers Association, now celebrating its 75th year of supporting science education. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to the Lab Out Loud podcast, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And today we're talking about graphic novels. What makes a good comic for the classroom? Can we have a story that's the right blend of education and entertainment?
Because I remember when I was a kid, and it was like, oh, this is like an educational cartoon. It has a certain look, it has a certain feel, but I really try very hard to make my stuff just appeal to that sense of like, oh, like, you know, like when kids like are excited about Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh, or about just like their favorite cartoon shows or like whatever. Like, you know, I want it to fit in next to those things seamlessly.
And that's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
And in today's episode, we're joined by a previous guest, Nathan Schreiber.
My name's Nathan Schreiber. I run a business called Science Ninjas, and I make games and graphic novels. This is something that I'm trotting out now. I'd say my stuff teaches hard science. Like it teaches like physics, it teaches chemistry, might be teaching some biology, but you know, this is some of the more challenging subjects I think that we deal with.
So that's what I was going to ask, actually. You had, obviously, Valence, your games there, and Valence Plus. And now you're branching out into the physics world with Simple Machines, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But you're kind of intimating that you are going to go down some biology paths, maybe?
I would love to. I really would like to at some point. You know, I mean, my ambition is to basically teach the entire next generation science standards through graphic novels and games for elementary and middle school. So that's a lot of biology. It's a lot of earth science.
Oh, wow.
Some physics and chemistry. It's going to take me a long time. You know, like it's going to take me anywhere between 10 and 15 years. But
sure.
That's basically what I'm going to be doing. I got that scheduled for the next decade or so.
So I was thinking of like maybe some biology things that you might do, like Krebs cycle or
photosynthesis.
Yeah.
You know, like blood. I think just learning how like a lot of anatomy and physiology and getting really into how the cells work and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of stuff that I would really be interested in doing. There's a lot of different science products out there, and like, you know, I have some friends that work on stuff that's like, you know, it's a little bit softer. It's a little bit more like general interest. Like, you know, it's like dinosaurs like are cool, or like sharks are interesting. And those books like sell really well and they're really popular. And it's because sharks and dinosaurs are really cool. But I want to make stuff that's like, you know, conservation of matter is cool. You know, like I want to make something that's like maybe a little bit more vital for like a holistic understanding of science, but still figures out ways to make it really engaging for young learners.
Last time we talked about your games, and we got a little bit of your background. So our listeners who maybe didn't hear that episode, tell us a little bit about your background. How'd you get to this point?
Well, I'm an engineer, or I studied engineering. I was a computer science major, and it was interesting. I didn't really love science until I got into college, and I sort of had these physics requirements, and I just like really fell in love with it.
That was my experience too.
Yeah, it was just like this like sort of like universal truth of just like, oh my God, like you look at the stars and you're like, these rules that I'm learning, like they're applicable everywhere. It's omnipresent. There was something, I don't know, very humbling and awe-inspiring about that. But, you know, like this was like during my like junior or senior year, like I was satisfying these requirements, and I was a computer science major, but, you know, if I'm honest, I was really just like drawing cartoons throughout college. So that's.
I'm still waiting to get my physics appreciation. I don't know when I'm going to get that epiphany yet.
But I started working in the fashion industry actually right out of college, because I was an illustrator, and they needed people to design like prints and patterns that went on clothes. It's actually kind of a silly job. I was designing patterns and prints that went on women's underwear for places like Walmart and like Mandy's, Target, like these, you know, these. Okay. I mean, it's like just the sheer bulk of stuff that is created for this market. It's just huge. Like I was responsible for something like 5 or 6 designs a day.
Wow.
So I kind of got burned out, and I was always into comics. I was still making my own comics, and eventually I just started making my own comics, and then I like got kind of tapped to do comics that were sort of like heavy on information. Like I did a comic with an economist named Jonathan Gruber called Healthcare Reform, and it explained.
Oh, that's right. I remember you talking about this.
Yeah, so that was like, pretty complicated subject matter. And then I worked with FEMA to make some comics that went on their website. It was really just about like telling kids like how to deal with situations like earthquakes and tornadoes, like just kind of like emergencies that FEMA has to deal with. But like I had these characters and they were going through situations and stuff. And so, I sort of got this like, was doing a lot of comics that were explaining things. And, I loved science. And I just started making these Science Ninjas comics and started putting them on my website. I started going to schools and camps and stuff and showing the comics and doing experiments with the kids. And then it really took off when I made Valence, which is, if anyone isn't familiar with Valence, it's kind of like Rummy, but for chemistry. Like you're building, instead of building suits, you're building molecules out of different elements from the periodic table. And then it's just, I just kept making more games that added Valence Plus and just finished up this book and really excited to show it to the world right now.
Well, let's wait here. I feel like I missed. How did you go from engineer to fashion though?
How did I do that? That's
Did
interesting.
you go,
like I
were
said,
you an engineer in college?
I was an engineer in college. Yeah.
Okay.
I was an engineer in college. I studied computer science. I was more on the graphic side of things.
Okay.
Like I had this idea of like working in video games, but it was just like, I was illustration was my most marketable skill when I got out of college.
I see.
To be honest, I can't program my way out of a paper bag, and probably couldn't back then either. I was not a really great computer science major, and I just didn't really quite have the passion for it, to be frank.
Sure. It's so funny when you think about this, because these are the tales we try to tell our students. I think of even the conversations I have with my own kids, but students I've had in the past, like, when are we going to use this? We're never going to need this, and so on and so on and so on. And, here's a conversation that you went in for engineering and computer science and came out in fashion for a while, and now illustrations. Like, the world takes you all over the place. And it sounds like all those little skill sets and all those little, pieces of background helped along the way. And that's the thing we try to tell students is like, you never know.
I really do think that's true. It's also challenging. Like sometimes you find yourself like, I think that I pursued computer science really out of a commercial idea of just like, oh, this is going to be a very good skill to have. And they're going to need people that have aesthetic senses in this world. So maybe it's a world that I can fit into, but I just couldn't really I couldn't really get into it. But I do think a lot about how I ended up designing these games, and that's basically computer science. That's like, like designing a card game.
They're algorithms.
Exactly. It's designing paper software essentially. So like it's all going to come together. But yeah, like in terms of what you're talking to these kids about too, it's like, I would say like, don't, especially like these really passionate kids, it's really hard to just like, oh, like, well, this is a really practical thing that I'm not quite so interested in. Like, you just won't stick with it. It's like, it's really hard to stick with something that you're just not interested in when the world's just full of so many interesting things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was interesting because I was at the Wisconsin Society of Science Teachers Conference, and you were there too. You were an exhibitor there, and one of the hallmarks of that conference was like a raffle prize giveaway where the vendors were asked to donate something that would later be raffled off at our town hall meeting. And it was interesting because I was there at that town hall meeting, and when the Science Ninjas pack came up, which was, I think it was a book in Valence, the game there was this kind of like murmur through the crowd. They wanted to get it. And it was interesting because it was, there was other things there that people wanted, but I just felt that the room was a little bit more electric. Like, this is the one I want.
Why do you think that was?
I don't know. It was something that you could take back and do, instead of like having, like there would be, I'm not trying to knock any other of the vendors there, but some of them are more like a food for thought kind of a thing. Like, maybe I'll do this, but you could take this and do something with it. You could actually
play it that night. You could just, okay, let's go play this game. And also that's something that I think about, like part of the reason why I put so much effort into the visuals too is because what I want is I want a teacher to take out my game and the kids just to be immediately like, what is that? Like, I want to know what that is. I think that's like really important. I mean, we were talking about meals earlier, but it's like, when a meal looks good, it tastes better. Like these are things that are like really, really important. So if something just looks visually interesting, I think that people, no matter what, they're just like, oh, I need to investigate that. I need to find out what's going on there. So that's like a big part of what I'm trying to do is try to bring, like there are a lot of science comics. There's a lot of stuff that's similar to that. And sometimes I feel like it's kind of made by committee. It's like, oh, okay, like, wouldn't it be great if this existed? Well, let's get maybe an illustrator and, maybe I have a friend that draws, or like it's somebody that doesn't really have like a passion for it. And it sort of comes together and it sometimes it feels like a little bit less than the sum of its parts because it just doesn't really feel like it has this, it doesn't really look like the kind of visual materials that kids are engaging with. It looks kind of less than those sometimes.
Wait a minute.
Do like really, really great stuff. Like my friend, Catherine Roy does these like gorgeous books about like elephants and about animals, and they're just, they're stunning. But sometimes, like, cause I'm always looking at like the competition and seeing what other people are doing. And, and it's just like, oh, okay. Like, cause I remember when I was a kid and it was like, oh, this is like an educational cartoon, it has a certain look, it has a certain feel. And I really try very hard to make my stuff look, and just appeal to that sense of like, oh, like when kids like are excited about Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh, about just like their favorite cartoon shows or like whatever. Sure. Like, I want it to fit in next to those things seamlessly.
This has sort of a Teen Titans vibe to me. That was my initial reaction. Maybe because I just watched the movie.
No, it's got that vibe. Well, Teen Titans is a very interesting. I love that show, and it's very inspired by a lot of Japanese media. And if you like look at like the comics that kids are reading today, like because kids don't really read like Spider-Man and Superman. Like that's a lot of like adults are actually the ones that are like reading those types of comics.
Sure.
Kids are reading manga. They're reading Japanese comics.
My daughter's a freshman and really into it. And she's getting all these books they're backwards. Well, they're not backwards, but exactly, and I'm like, what is going on here? And the library labels them wrong. And it was a whole new world that she is. It's amazing because they can go down these genres and niches now because of the internet and be exposed to all kinds of different cultures. It's really kind of fascinating.
And they're so extensive. Like the series are, they're just like these huge collections of books and stuff. And it's funny because like I got the inspiration for Science Ninjas actually when I was consuming one of these series. It's called Naruto.
That's what she's watching. Yep.
Oh yeah, well,
she's totally into
Naruto, it. In Naruto, I call this it's like a subgenre, and this isn't like a term that anybody else uses except for me, but I call it like tactical manga or tactical anime. Because what happens is the characters, there's always some villain, and he shows up, and it's like, oh, he's unbeatable. Like this happens every time, and it's predictable, and it can be a little tedious sometimes. It's so predictable. But what happens is like it's essentially like one time, like I was watching Naruto, and I swear to God, it was almost exactly like a word problem. There was a character, and he had oil skin, and there was water inside him, and he sort of, and the water would expand when it got hotter. Okay, so we're already dealing with like hydrophobic substances. We're dealing with like, what happens to air molecules when they get heated, when they expand, and he's exploding. And, they solve this, they sort of, it's like, oh, well, how do we beat this guy? And they essentially, coat him in metal. And then when he heats up, the gold melts and then it cools off and then he can't expand anymore. So it's like, does it really hold up to like rigorous, like, scientific, like examination? Like probably not. I don't really know where this guy's like energy source is coming from. It's from like ninja power, I'm sure. But there's always like there's always like okay, there's an obstacle. The characters need to think it out. They need to come up with like a legitimate solution and then implement it. And it just seems so much like, it's a word problem. And so many word problems, like when you read physics textbooks and stuff like that, they are not dealing with ninja battles. It's very often like a weight is hanging from a scale. And it's like, it is difficult to like, just as a thought exercise, it is difficult to conceive of something that is more boring than a weight. Like even a rock, like, it's a rock. Oh, maybe it was on the beach where I met the love of my life or something like that. Like a weight is just very
Mass
boring.
A hangs off the edge of a platform.
Exactly.
Well, all of that happens because you're trying to reduce down, you're trying to remove all other variables.
That's true.
To have a very, very, confined scenario.
And there's value to that. And there are some elements of this book, Big Trouble with Simple Machines, where it's like characters are lifting weights. Like that does happen. But there's also like a context. There's a motivation. The characters have arguments over how they're going to do it. And they get mad when somebody else's solution is implemented instead of theirs. So you can make those problems. I agree with you that there's value in reducing a problem to like those simple elements so people can really understand things.
Yeah.
But you can also make like, you can change the stakes, you can change the principles, the motivation, like something's hanging. Well, what's below it? Like who put it up there? Like that already makes it more interesting if you sort of know these things. So it just seems to me like there's, like I was reading Nardo and I was just like, wow, these are word problems. Like this really could lend itself to teaching things. And the systems, it's sort of like, we're talking about like how deep in the rabbit hole you can get with this manga. Anime, and it's like they have these systems for like using magic or like using ninja powers, and it's like with any science fiction thing there are rules, but the rules are just so elaborate, and it's like you spend like half the comic explaining these rules, and it's like you could spend half the comic like explaining physics.
That's what makes it hard for like parents to jump in to be like, what are you watching? Because there's a considerable amount of like depth that you need to know before you're going into it. So I'm always
background,
basically lost.
It's a double-edged sword because it is like a little bit intimidating, like just how much is going on, but that is what makes them so engrossing too. Like it's like American cartoons and a lot of American comic books. It's like, okay, there's like one issue, there's one episode, it's self-contained, they wrap it up at the end, and not with this Japanese stuff, like never. It's like a saga that spans like 4 years or something. So it does get you really sucked in.
Sure.
So you've tried to replicate that within some of your work, obviously. And the latest work you have out is basically a graphic novel, comic book, called Big Trouble with Simple Machines. So you use the same characters as in Valence, right?
Yeah, they're the same characters. It's like a subset of them. There's like 4 characters from Valence that are in Big Trouble.
So what was your motivation to do Simple Machines?
I was so I've told you that I want to make like a kind of a larger curriculum. But this is a pretty ambitious project. Like I've made comics before, but this would be something that like I am writing and drawing and coloring, and I want to get the science right. So like I have there's a lot of material that I wanted to cover, but I looked at that and I was like, the story kind of felt like it wrote itself. Like there's 6 simple machines. So I'll have 6 chapters and there'll be 6 different obstacles and they'll need to use a different simple machine to get through each one. So it was one of those things where like the plot and the story seemed like really evident. I was like, okay, I can do this. And if I can do this, then I'm going to really know how to handle this type of project, how to handle
trials. Trials you call them, right?
And it seemed like, and it also seemed like a good place to start off with like the audience. Like I don't want to make something, I will say like, I don't want to make something that's like, like a giant soap opera where you need to read one book before you read another book. Like that's not what I want to make, but I do want to make it so like the characters are consistent, and there's sort of like an arc in a world that is consistent through all of the different books, and so you can so you can really feel engaged in it that way. But it's like pretty like this is something that could start off with like a 3rd grader could read this and it'd help out with their material. In fact. It teaches to the next generation science standards for the engineering curriculum for 3rd through fifth grade, as well as I hate how like the MGSS standards are like 3 PS2-1, like, but it's basically balanced and unbalanced forces on objects. I mean, that's like fundamentally what all of these simple machines are about. They're, levers and inclined planes, things that are redirecting force and, and explaining how work and, mechanical advantage work.
I think it's interesting because you have a lot of liberties to expand the descriptors, your visual descriptors here, than you would if you were limited to a photograph. And I think about all the attempts to make something, as authentic as possible in real world science applications. But in the same token, you lose some of the freedom to showcase exactly what's going on. So I look at, for instance, like on page 61, you have a screw. And of course we teach this is an inclined plane wrapped around, a rod there. And so, but you're actually showing it. You can expand the view. Yeah. You can use your artistry to give a more clear picture of what's happening. And so this little snippet here, I'm like, oh, this is what textbooks need, because we don't see that enough.
Yeah, I think it's like very important. I mean, like models are so, I think that it's like, okay, so like, like everybody talks about STEM and, now there's like STEAM, and I almost feel like there's sort of like, okay, like what isn't, because it's like, what isn't included in like science, technology?
Stream.
Yeah, didn't you say stream?
They're talking about adding in reading.
Oh, and reading too. Okay. I mean, because it's like, when you take like science and art, I mean, what isn't encompassed in those things? So I kind of would like, I mean, this is just my own personal hobby horse here. I would almost rather it doesn't make like a nice acronym, but I want it to be like design, because it's really, I don't really think we're talking about anything other than design, but it's so fundamental when you think about science, because there's just so many things that like, okay, so there's like the conceptual, like you were talking about before, like, oh, okay, like it's a screw is an inclined plane, wrapped around an axle. But, it's like you need to see something like, you're not really going to see like a real world example of that. So sometimes you really need that conceptual things. And then there's just like frameworks. There's so many things in science where you're studying something that's way bigger than a photograph could ever show, or it's way smaller than a photograph could ever show. And what we think of as, atoms or the solar system, like these are things that people have just designed, and that's what's in our head. So I think it's really crucial to use comics for this, and just about every single science textbook does. I just think we need even more of it.
I also like the fact that this also encourages students to show what they've learned, or teachers can assess students on what they have learned via visual models as well. And so students have the capability now of drawing out their learning instead of just writing down or repeating a definition or doing a calculation. And I think that needs to be done more. We also have the tools. Yeah, we also have the tools to do that a lot easier with touchscreen Chromebooks and other drawing tools that are online, that a student can, you could show the pitch of a screw or the tightness of the threads, and you can actually, show a mechanical advantage in more than just in a calculation.
Yeah, in fact, I just saw a recent study, and I can't cite it unfortunately, but it said basically that you learn twice as effectively when you draw something than when you write it down, which I mean sort of makes a lot of intuitive sense to me.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's like you have to understand it. And actually something that I'm excited about as the book comes out is in the back of the book. I don't know if you guys caught this, but there's like a word problem where it's like there's basically this very heavy block that the characters need to get out of a hole. And I'm inviting readers to design their own apparati for digging this thing out. And I'm encouraging everybody to email me, and obviously I'll like post it on social media and stuff, but I would love to see kids' solutions, because it's just, it's like something like, and like I say like, oh, if you have an unlimited budget, what would you come up with? Like, well, what if you were doing it with as few resources as possible? What would be the most efficient way to do that? So
it looks like the tesseract in there.
Good way to get kids to think about design and engineering, which are, so closely connected.
I also note that at the back of the book, I'm noticing a couple of things that you're encouraging students or kids to do on their own. Like you have an inclined plane that they could try out at home. And a lot of this is pretty simple material.
Yes.
I know my son would gravitate towards it. He's all into slime again. I thought that had come and gone, but it has found a resurgence. But he's kind of liking some of that, like doing some of those crafts on his own, just exploring. I think he would eat some of this up, especially the rulers and the quarters, and I would never get the quarters back. But
yeah, you can build your own simple machines, and something that I made a really big point of, because like I think I was telling you, like I used to go into schools, I would go into camps, we do experiments. Everything is like very easy to do. Like sometimes it's like, like, cause I would always look for good experiments to do. And sometimes the experiments are like incredibly elaborate and the results are like very like muddy. Like you're not even really sure what you're looking at. Like so something in a few of the experiments, like I really love, it's like very simple, but just like cutting a rubber band and basically using that as a way to measure force. Like how far does it stretch? Because it's this very, very, it's like, because you can tell, you can have kids like pull on so one of the experiments is just showing how, basically a lever works. You pull a door open on the outer edge of the door, and it's much easier than if you're, say, pulling it or pushing it on the inner part of that door, near the hinge. And it's like, like you can sort of feel that difference, but if you're taping a rubber band and pulling it, it's like you can see how much further it stretches when you're pulling it from the inside of that hinge. So it's just like very visual ways to understand things. I think that's, I don't know, just I'm obviously like a pretty visual guy. So I try to make like really visual solutions for everybody else.
When I look at a page of these in your book, how long, I mean, every page is very different. But like, let's say I'm looking at page 100. It's got two big panels, top, bottom. How long does that take to create? Is it?
It depends on. It varies from panel to panel. Obviously, there are some pages that take forever. I think the last two pages in the book are the last two pages of story in the book. Like that they just took so long to do because there's a lot going on.
Well, you look, there's stuff in the background and all kinds of things like that.
Well, it's a whole world, I really want people to feel like they're they're not in some like, oh, it's a magic classroom and there's a teacher, you know what I mean? Like I don't want that feel at all. Like I want it to be like, oh, okay, like I don't know, like a lot of stories for kids, like it's like they basically are like the kids are like sort of helpers for adults.
Always, yes, just standing there.
No, like let's not do that. Like let's have like Eureka is 11 and she's the one driving the car, and I'm like, does that make sense? Like I don't know, but like it's a comic book, it's fine. So the thing that's like the big X factor is how long it takes to write these things, because what I do is I basically alternate between drawing really rough pictures on the back of like note cards and stuff, and then like working on the script and then figuring how that all is going to work out. But once I get all of that set, like I basically, I don't pencil it. I draw it directly on like a tablet. So
that was my next question. Yeah. How that works. So with a pen, like on a tablet. Yeah,
exactly. I have like a touch screen, so that helps. So I do that, and that takes I'd say it takes about one day to ink, I guess, like to put down the black lines and then to color it and shade it and letter it. Like I'd say that takes like it takes about 7 or 8 hours. But like, sometimes it's like I said, like the writing, and sometimes even just coming up with those like rough drawings, like figuring out like, oh, like what angle am I going to show this from? Sometimes that can take, like 3 or 4 hours or something like that, depending on how tricky it is. And sometimes it takes 5 minutes. Just like,
what do you mean by letter it? Is that the speech bubbles or the
stuff? The speech bubbles. It's like, that takes about like 20 minutes or something like that. Unless like you get really hung up on a bit of dialogue or something.
Sure, sure.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you had to make sure that you got the science right. So how do you verify that you are correct in the science?
Well, obviously I do a lot of homework beforehand, like I'm reading a lot of textbooks and I'm looking at how a lot of teachers are teaching this material. But, like one of the reasons why I like going to conferences like WISTE is that I meet a lot of teachers and then they become really great resources. Like, I think there were 3 teachers at WISTE that actually helped edit this book. So there were 8.
Oh, really?
8 middle and high school science teachers that basically I send the rough draft to. Like, so I have an editor who, just she's more there, like, it's actually good that she doesn't have a science background, because she can tell me like, oh, like this doesn't make sense, or like, and also just things with like the characters and the story and the plot. So I show everything to her, and then we make the notes, and then it's like I send it out to like these 8 or however many science teachers I can that want to do this. And I'm like, hey, I'll give you a free book and you'll get a credit in the book. If I could single out one person who did like really a lot, it was Sam Clausen, who's where is he teaching out of? I don't know. It's in Wisconsin. But he like, he really saved my bacon at one point, because I had a page where I was really talking about like wheels. And, I thought I was explaining one thing, and he was like, I think what you're really just talking about here is like rolling friction. And that's not really that, I don't think that's what you want to teach. And he really helped me work on this, on that section. There's just certain sections where it's just like, oh, am I explaining this clearly? Or am I teaching this the way that your students need to hear it? So I get really invaluable feedback from a lot of teachers that way. And that really helps.
Fantastic.
It reminds me, when we talked about games, you did a lot of, like, we talked a lot about game design when we did the last episode on Valence and Valence Plus, and like all the testing and kind of things like that. So it's a little bit like that. You're kind of testing the book. Definitely.
No. And I even like, there's a school out in Barrington that, like I went out there. Actually, it's pretty fun. They actually helped me write the epilogue to the book, which is really fun. But like I showed a lot of the material to them too, and just make sure that it's something that they want to engage with. But yeah, there's a robot in the epilogue that has high heels, and that was a contribution from I think an 11-year-old girl in
That's awesome.
Andrew class. I was like, yeah, why not? That robot should have high heels. Let's do it.
Yeah,
we need more robots with high heels.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
So the book's coming out shortly, or is just out.
It might, by the time this goes out, I think it might be available.
All right. What is the pre-testing been, or your conference kind of like attendees? What have been the initial feedback?
People really like it so far. Like everybody has told me too, like, and this is really nice, is that everybody said like, oh, like it's a really like physically, it's like a very like nice book. Like it's very clearly high quality materials and stuff. So I was, I really wanted to make it something that was, not something that was just like cheaply made or the binding would fall out or something like that. So I really went like the extra mile with the production, and I'm glad that people are noticing. But yeah, people have told me that they like it, that they've read it with their kids and they had a blast. And, so.
How have the teachers said they plan to use it, or they think they're going to use it?
Well, I had a Kickstarter for this, and I had like a classroom pack where there was like 20 books, and I had a special deal for that. And I think 14 teachers signed up for that. So we're going to find out, okay. I'm really excited to find out how they're going to use it. And, like one of the, there's some other teachers that use this book and use my materials an awful lot. And that's homeschoolers.
Sure.
Yeah.
So they're going to be using it an awful lot too. And I'm actually going to quite a few homeschooling conferences too. And these are people that just by definition, they're almost always looking for like an alternative way to teach material. So the graphic novel format is something that they're really excited about.
And I imagine it'll show up in school libraries and public libraries.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's going into Chicago Public Library next month. Pretty excited about that.
I can imagine like a scene from Dead Poets Society where the teacher's like, get up on your desks and rip out chapter 4, Simple Machines. We're not going to need that. Here's your new learning today.
Oh man. Oh my. Yeah. I hope so.
If that does happen, and we definitely need to get pictures, listeners. So show us this happening.
Defacing of public property. We're going to have teachers basically recording that. Yeah, sure.
Well, like these older textbooks that are out of circulation. Those ones. Yes.
Well, there's this thing that I showed, I think, in my Kickstarter video, and it was like this physics textbook, and it just showed these people on a seesaw. And it was like they weren't even having fun. And it was just like, I don't know, it's like, wow, like, you go through the effort of putting the people on the seesaw. It's like, can't you at least just draw like a smile on their face or something? It's just, I don't know. Yeah.
That's the other nice thing is you don't have to worry about like fashion styles going out of date here, because like when we have those old pictures and you're like, oh, look at that.
Well, no, you bring up like a really good point there though, because it's one of the reasons why I really like doing it in this format, because Science Ninjas takes place in sort of like this, it's a little bit amorphously defined, but it's like a science fiction world. And it's a world where like, yes, like 11-year-olds can drive cars, but like, there's a lot of science narratives and even science graphic fiction that is just like, it's historical. It's like, oh, let's show the discovery of this theorem or something along those lines. But unfortunately, it's like most of those stories star a particular type of person. They're usually like an old European dude in like a tweed coat. So it's like, if you're like a woman, or, if you're not like European ancestry, or if you just don't like tweed coats, like you might not have like an access point for those stories. So this, I think it's kind of a benefit that it's like, oh, it's a science fiction world. There's not really like history the way that there is in these kinds of stories. So like people can get a touchstone with some of the characters and some of the material that maybe they wouldn't be able to do with some other narratives.
That's a good point.
And it's timely, of course, because not only is graphic novels, it's having its day within the Common Core ELA standards there, but you also can attract a group that is open more to a gender fluidity as well. And I think sometimes that needs to be addressed too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we just need a little bit more. We just need a little bit more representation in a lot of these materials. And when you are looking backwards, it can sometimes reinforce some of those ideas. So it's nice to just have kind of a clean slate.
That's excellent. Now we should, before we let you go, talk about the games. You have Valence Plus and Valence. Any more? Does this mean you're leaving games behind, or games still coming too?
No,
I thought so. I
got a pretty interesting plan for Valence. I'm not going to break any news here because I'm still working out the kinks. And I still want to make more games. Like what I think I would like to do with the games is teach sort of like a broad curriculum with the graphic novels, and then use the games to focus on material that is particularly challenging. Like the thing about the games that I think is really, really useful for teachers is that there's a lot of material that is, I think that sometimes as science boosters, we can sort of get into this phase of being like, oh, everything is like so interesting. And it's just like the teachers and the way that you teach it. And, and it's like sometimes like some material is just a little bit dry. And in particular, to really learn something, you need to have like rote learning. You need to like repeat the same action a bunch of times. Like the problem is that that's just unengaging. It's pretty boring. But if you have that as a game, then you can have that sort of repetitive learning. But if it's in a different context every time, and that context is like winning a game, players are going to be really engaged. So, that's what I want to do with the games.
Oh, excellent. Well, the website is Science Ninjas. You can find all the ninjas there in game form, in comic form, graphic novel form, and join in on the universe of Science Ninjas. Nathan, thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lab Out Loud. If you're looking for information or show notes about this episode, head on over to our website, laboutloud.com. If you've been listening to Lab Out Loud, play the episodes in class or for your students, or simply value teacher-driven support for science education, please consider supporting our show by becoming a Lab Out Loud Patreon. Visit our website for more information.
Of course, we always love to hear from you, our listeners. Maybe you have an idea for a guest. Are there topics in science and science education that need to be addressed? Submit your comments, concerns, and suggestions through our contact page on laboutloud.com or tweet to us at laboutloud. Also, you can find Lab Out Loud on iTunes, Spotify, or anywhere else you can find podcasts. And while you're there, consider leaving a comment, rating us, or liking us at these services. Your feedback helps others find our show.